So if you are a fan of Pride and Prejudice, you're probably familiar with Mr. Collins and that famous scene when he comes to visit Elizabeth Bennet and her sisters at Longbourn, and he says, "I'm going to read to you all." And he picks up a book called Fordyce's Sermons. But what are Fordyce's Sermons? What were they about? And what does this have to do with being an ideal woman in Regency and Georgian times? Well, I'm going to answer those questions for you here today. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where I talk about classic literature and history. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. Okay, up first is, what are Fordyce's Sermons? What's this book Mr. Collins is trying to read his cousins? Well, James Fordyce was a preacher who was very, very popular in London. He was born in 1720 and died in 1796. And while he was very popular preaching from the pulpit, he also published some very popular books. And one of them was called Sermons to Young Women, which is the most popular of his books. It came out in many, many editions. And what it was a conduct book. And conduct books in the late Georgian times had become very popular, and basically what they were guides to how to conduct your life, right? So think of it as a hybrid of etiquette and morality and just overall worldviews, things to avoid, that sort of thing. And among these very popular conduct books, Fordyce's Sermons for Young Women was one of the most popular. It was pretty much everywhere. In fact, in Pride and Prejudice, the Bennets just have that book laying around their house. In Pride and Prejudice 2005, it makes it look like Mr. Collins brought the book with him, but really the Bennets already own that book, as most households of that income with young women in their house probably did. So pretty much Fordyce's Sermons is broken up into 14 chapters that are called sermons. So it's like, here's sermon 1, it's on this topic. Here's sermon 2, it's on this topic. Today we're going to be looking at sermon number 1, which is his sort of general sermon before he gets into particulars on everything from modesty of apparel to piety to accomplishments. And really what he did was lay out for us what this time period thought of as the qualities the ideal girl and young woman and then woman would have. Of course, these ideals were not unchallenged. Mary Wollstonecraft attacked James Fordyce in her Vindications of the Rights of Women because, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly forward-thinking when it came to women's station and rights. Of course, there's this overall general debate of, why did Jane Austen specifically name this book? Why did she have Mr. Collins, of all people, pick it up? And of course, in the book, when Mr. Collins does start reading Fordyce's Sermons, Lydia Bennet interrupts him and is like, "Boy, you're boring." But of course, that is Lydia Bennet. So a lot of people in the literary circles have thought that maybe Jane Austen was trying to identify James Fordyce and his thoughts with Mr. Collins and was a rejection of them, while other people have made the very valid argument that a lot of what Jane Austen wrote actually supports what he wrote. They coincide in many ways. I personally think that there's this middle road of, it was a major book at the time and she was engaging in a dialogue. And also I feel like she was going for some irony, and I'm going to talk about that irony in a minute. So, are you guys ready to discover the underlying principles of being an ideal woman in the Regency era? This is some deep stuff we're about to get into. And this is what we learn in Sermon 1, which is actually titled Sermon 1 on the importance of the female sex, especially the younger part. Importance is happening here. First, I think it's very important for any human to understand their ultimate purpose in life. And James Fordyce is nice enough to tell women exactly what their purpose is. And that is to be amiable and lovable by men. That is right. That is the ultimate honor that any woman can achieve, is to be lovable by men. In fact, he says that what honor can be enjoyed by your sex equal to that of showing yourself every way worth of the virtuous tenderness from ours? And also, what can be conceived so properly female as inspiring, improving, and continuing such a tenderness in all its charming extent? After all, for men, virtuous women are the sweeteners, the charm of human life. So now that we understand, according to James Fordyce, women's basic purpose is to make themselves as lovable as possible to men, we can delve deeper into exactly how to do that. The first one up is that it's a woman's job to make herself as pretty and attractive as possible. In fact, if she does not, she is failing at the whole purpose God made her. As he points out here, should they, women, by any neglect of their persons render themselves less amiable than God has made them, they would so far disappoint the design of their creation. So, you better work on being pretty. In fact, you should avail yourself of every decent attraction by not neglecting your appearance, and by studying ingenuity and elegance as much as possible. But not only to be the ideal Regency girl do you have to be pretty, you can't let that get in the way of you developing far more important qualities, such as grace of mind, modesty, meekness, prudence, piety, with all virtuous and charitable occupations, all beautiful and useful accomplishments. So that's essential. So you have to be pretty, both inside and out. But this is something important. All of this is related to your rank in society. That is correct. In fact, women are told to never go beyond their circumstances, never aspire above their station, and only to attain accomplishments suited to the rank and condition of the life. Which, this is important to note that this whole book was aimed at the upper middle class and the upper class. Obviously, the country gentry, which is what the Bennets were, would definitely qualify. And it's interesting that in the book, he even talks very slightingly of merchants. And if you remember my video, How to Be a Lady or Gentleman in Jane Austen's time, you will remember that everybody looked down on merchants. And again, if you were a merchant's daughter reading this, you're getting looked down on again. But whatever you do, don't aspire above your rank. Be pretty inside and out. Now, what is up next to be the ideal Regency girl? And it is have self-esteem, right? Doesn't this sound like a Dove commercial, only from 1790s, where you are supposed to have self-esteem? It was seen that only women who've lost their self-respect would, of course, go run off and do something infamous like Lydia Bennet. And of course, the interesting thing about this call for self-esteem is it was incredibly important for the advancement of women. As much as Mary Wollstonecraft might attack Fordyce's sermons, the fact that he's encouraging women to have self-esteem, and as we'll talk about in a minute, this idea that women can have a positive effect on their family and friends, was actually a huge revolution during this time by itself. A few hundred years before, in Europe, women were seen as seductresses, as the bane of society, as the daughters of Eve, as pretty much the harbingers of negativity and sin. But what happened was that eventually men sort of stopped showing up to church. And so these preachers were preaching all this pretty much anti-woman stuff to a crowd of women. And first of all, that's not going to go over very well. But also, if your whole congregation is women and all you're doing is putting them down like that, eventually they're going to stop showing up too. So what happened is they realized we have to start appealing to these women. And they're also like, if we can get the women all interested in religion, they can maybe bring the men back. And so there was this cultural shift from viewing women as like these fallen daughters of Eve to being very righteous and pure in the center of families and purity, and how they were supposed to bring everybody up in their family. And so by shifting this conversation religiously that was around women, from bringing them out from being the ultimate sinners to being people who can have positive influences and are the religious center of their family, this had a huge impact on women and their self-respect, because all of a sudden they had something to have self-respect about. They were these uplifters of all humanity. And so while a lot of what Fordyce says is obviously very opposed to what a lot of women believe today, this was a very important step into getting to the view of women we have today. Because when women could have self-respect, this gave them more options. They thought, oh, well, I'm supposed to be an uplifter of my family. I should read books. I should do this. I should branch out my interests. And that really furthered women's education and so many other aspects. Which brings us to the next point of how to be the ideal Regency girl is recognize you have power and then use the power for good. I thought this description of a young woman's power was kind of funny. Essentially, he says that young women have very great and extensive influence with men, and if she also be beautiful, the first impression is irresistible. So apparently all you young ladies are just irresistible to men, according to Fordyce. And then he talks about how this power was God-given and should never be abused. So basically, how do you abuse this power? Well, you act all flirty with guys, you lower women's morals, you do all of that sort of stuff. But how do you use it for good? There's two aspects. One is you either reform men or you refine them. And of course, in the Reformation concept, it's this idea that if you are a very virtuous woman and a man interacts with you, he'll be inspired to be a better man because of you, and if he's in love with you, for you. And I think this idea, in some respects, we do see in Jane Austen's work, such as Darcy. He changes because of Elizabeth. Not that he was that horrible of a guy to begin with, but you know where I'm going with this. In fact, it was believed that a woman could reclaim a multitude of men because no man can withstand the soft persuasion of her words, but chiefly of her looks and actions, habitually exercised on the side of goodness. Meanwhile, even if a guy was already overall great, spending time with women would refine his manners, make him more gentlemanlike, rub out any uncouth spots, and overall make him a better guy. And I feel like he was essentially summing up that common belief, which is, of course, if you see a guy who's very in tune with women's issues, you're like, oh yeah, he grew up with a lot of sisters or something. And essentially, it was that idea that if you grew up around women, if you spent time with women, you would become a better man. And it would help you to develop honorable love for women instead of false gallantry. And of course, honorable love is where you're generally actually honorable and care about people, where false gallantry is you're just trying to flatter and get what you want out of the situation. And so I feel like this next little section of the ideal girl and woman in the family is where we start seeing a lot of irony. I think Jane Austen might have been trying to point out when she had Mr. Collins start reading Fordyce's sermons to the Bennet family, because the Bennet family is essentially the ultimate example of what not to do according to Fordyce, and the fact that he's about to read what not to do to the ultimate family that's doing it is kind of really funny if you know what Fordyce's sermons is about. So first up, from the perspective of a daughter is encouraged to do nothing to make her parents unhappy, do all in her power to give them delight. But then the thing that really fascinates me is that for several paragraphs, it describes in detail what not to do, and what not to do could be summarized up as, don't be Lydia Bennet. Like literally, it describes Lydia's situation of running wild, of throwing herself away on a guy who's not worthy of her, of causing her parents heartache. And also it brings this out that if a daughter does act like Lydia Bennet, it will result in this. It says, so the honor and peace of a family are, in this view, much more dependent on the conduct of daughters than of sons. And one young lady going astray shall subject her relations to such discredit and distress as the united good conduct of all her brothers and sisters, supposing them numerous, shall never, scarce ever be able to repair. Now, doesn't that sound extremely similar to when Elizabeth Bennet says essentially that Lydia's ruined them all? Her wild conduct has ruined all of them. And that's one of those examples where often what Jane Austen stories do is they play out what if all these things Fordyce says not to do happens. And then next up on being a wife, the what not to do wife section that reads like how not to be Mrs. Bennet. And the same exact thing on mothers. It reads how not to be Mrs. Bennet. Essentially, don't let your daughters run wild. Don't fill their heads with frivolity. Don't open them to censure. And also, don't drive your husband away by constantly nagging at him. Admittedly, if you've seen my video, 1995 versus 2005 Pride and Prejudice, you know what I think of Mr. Bennet. He has issues he needs to work out himself. But ultimately, nothing in the Bennet family is really working how James Fordyce thinks it should. And then finally, I just love that the ultimate purpose of being a mother is that it's national service to the British Empire. Pretty much, it says this. Why, ye daughters of Britain, are so many of you insensible to those brightest glories of your sex? Where is your love for your native country, which by thus excelling you might so nobly serve by raising children the proper way? And then I love that it goes on to warn these mothers that they should be raising the next generation of epic British grandeur instead of flaunting around in French style, right? I mean, you know, Fordyce, he has his priorities, right? It's all about empire and not high fashion, I guess. Anyway, so basically overall, those are the ways that a woman can live up to her ultimate purpose of being lovable by men and using her power for good. And how ultimately don't be Lydia Bennet or Mrs. Bennet. So that was just a quick overview of the first sermon from James Fordyce's collection. The other 13 go into more detail on the different topics, but this was his sort of like overall before he got into the nitty-gritty of other things. So let me know in the comments below, do you think you would live up to these Regency ideals? So again, my name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where I talk about classic literature and history. If you like either of those things, please subscribe and have an awesome day. Bye. I've also realized I also talk about Mr. Collins in quite a few of my videos, but he just touches so many important aspects of classic literature and history.